The acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the September air of 1855, mixing with the stench of burning canvas and spilled blood. Along the Oregon Trail, where thousands of hopeful families had passed seeking new lives in the promised lands of the West, another dream lay shattered in the morning mist. Iron Wolf's tomahawk pressed against Elena's throat, the obsidian edge sharp enough to part skin with the slightest pressure. A thin line of blood already traced down her neck as she clutched her newborn brother to her chest, his wails the only sound, piercing the unnatural silence that followed violence. Toksa ake wikakapikte, until we meet in death. The warrior whispered in Lakota, his paint-streaked face a mask of controlled fury. His dark eyes held something deeper than rage, a pain that matched the devastation surrounding them. Your people killed my son. Now you join the spirits. Elena couldn't understand his words, but she felt the finality in his voice, like winter wind, cutting through bone. Around them, the remains of her family's single wagon smoldered, her parents' bodies sprawled among scattered belongings, their blood darkening the prairie earth. The smell of death mingled with autumn grass and distant wood smoke from other campfires along the trail. The baby's cry pierced the morning air, again desperate and pure. Iron Wolf's grip tightened on his weapon, then faltered. In that infant's voice, he heard an echo that stopped his heart, his own son's final breath, a child's plea that would haunt him until the earth claimed him. "Wasinhin sni, I cannot," he said, lowering the tomahawk with emotion that seemed to tear something from his chest. The admission came out broken, foreign to his own understanding. Behind him, Running Deer dismounted with careful dignity, his weathered face grave as he surveyed the massacre his young warriors had committed. The peace chief's arrival came too late to prevent the bloodshed, but perhaps not too late to prevent something worse. "What have you done, Iron Wolf?" His voice carried the weight of a man who had spent years building fragile truces, only to watch them crumble in moments of rage. "What needed to be done," Iron Wolf replied, but conviction had drained from his voice like water from cracked pottery. "The trader at Fort Laramie said they were scouts for the Yellow Hair Soldiers. He said this man was mapping our sacred places for attack." The trader lied. Running Deer's words fell like stones into still water. This man was Pavel Novak, a peace speaker. He carried letters of safe passage worked to build understanding between our peoples and the whites who come seeking new homes. Elena watched the exchange without comprehension, understanding only the shift in Iron Wolf's expression, the way certainty crumbled into something raw, more dangerous than simple anger. Doubt was a poison that could kill a warrior's spirit more surely than any bullet, and she could see it working in the man who held her life in his hands. Running Deer continued, his voice heavy with sorrow. "I have met with this man 3 times at the treaty grounds. He spoke our language with respect, brought gifts for our children, shared meat at our fires. His death brings us no honor, only shame." Iron Wolf's jaw worked silently as he processed this revelation. The certainty that had driven him to violence was dissolving, replaced by the terrible possibility that he had become the very thing he fought against, a killer of innocence. "It's done," he said finally, the words barely audible. "The children live. That's mercy enough." But even as he spoke, Elena could see in his eyes that mercy would come with a price for all of them. Sparrow, the only woman among the war party, approached with reluctant steps. Years of trading with white merchants at river crossings had given her fragments of English enough to serve as translator when words became weapons more dangerous than tomahawks. "What do we do with them?" she asked in Lakota, her voice carefully neutral. But Elena caught something in the woman's expression, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested the question carried more weight than its simple words implied. Iron Wolf studied Elena's face, the fierce protective love blazing in her eyes, despite her terror, the way she held her brother, as if her body could shield him from the entire world. It reminded him of his sister dead, 3 winters now, from the white man's spotted sickness. It reminded him of choices that haunted his dreams and would continue to haunt them until the end of his days. "We take them home." He said the words falling like stones into still water. The declaration sent ripples through the assembled warriors. Take them home not as captives for torture or ransom, but as something else. Something undefined and potentially dangerous to the delicate balance of tribal politics. Elena felt herself lifted onto a horse behind Sparrow, her brother secure in her arms, but her world dissolving around her. As they rode toward the setting sun, she caught one last glimpse of her parents' bodies already attracting the attention of circling vultures in the vast blue sky. "Spoem, Mama. Spoem, Papa." She whispered in Czech goodbye, the only word her new captors would never understand, but would learn to recognize by the sound of a daughter's final farewell. Iron Wolf heard the tone, if not the words, recognizing the universal sound of grief. Without conscious thought, he dismounted and walked back to where a small wooden carving lay forgotten in the dust beside the burned wagon. Pavel Novak had been working on it during the long evenings of travel, a sparrow rough, but recognizable, intended as a gift for his son, when the boy was old enough to appreciate such things. Iron Wolf picked up the carving and slipped it into his medicine bag. He told himself it was evidence, a reminder of the choice he had made. But deep in his chest, something twisted with guilt, and in recognition he wasn't ready to face. The girl reminded him of his sister's fierce love. The baby's cry echoed his dead son's voice. And the wooden sparrow in his bag felt like an accusation wrapped in hope, a testament to a father's love that transcended the violence that had claimed his life. As the war party disappeared into the vastness of the prairie, Elena began to understand that survival would require more than courage or cleverness. It would require transformation, becoming someone new while holding on to the essential pieces of who she had been. Behind them, smoke continued to rise from the wagon's remains, a funeral pyre for one life and the birthplace of another. Elena Novak was dying in those flames, and what emerged would need to be something harder, more adaptable, and more necessary than the Czech immigrant's daughter had ever imagined possible. The Lakota village materialized from the prairie like a vision conjured from autumn mist. Dozens of buffalo-hide teepees, arranged in careful patterns that spoke of generations of wisdom. Smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing between the lodges, while dogs barked and horses grazed in the golden evening light. It should have been peaceful, but Elena could feel tension crackling through the camp's very air. Her arrival with Small Thunder, as the Lakota quickly dubbed her brother for his powerful lungs, sent immediate ripples of anger and curiosity through the community. Warriors who had lost family members to white soldiers' bullets gathered in hostile clusters, their voices low, but their intentions crystal clear, even to someone who didn't speak their language. "They should die," declared Stone Bear, whose scarred face and missing left eye told the story of too many battles fought and lost. White children grow into white soldiers. Kill the seedlings before they become poisonous trees. Elena understood none of the Lakota words, but she read their meaning in the warriors' faces, in the way hands moved instinctively to weapons when they looked at her and her brother. She clutched Small Thunder closer, his warmth and the steady rhythm of his breathing, the only comfort in this strange new world where her life hung by threads she couldn't see. Iron Wolf stood silent as debate raged around the council fire, the weight of his impulsive decision pressing down on him like mountain stone. He had chosen mercy in a moment of weakness, or perhaps strength, and now that choice threatened to fracture his leadership and endanger the very people he had sworn to protect. Running Deer raised his weathered hand for silence, his authority, as peace chief still carrying weight, despite the young warrior's hunger for revenge. Iron Wolf, these captives are your responsibility now. You chose to spare them when death would have been simpler. Now you must speak for them. All eyes turned to the young warrior whose reputation had been built on decisive action and unwavering strength. Iron Wolf had dreaded this moment since riding into the village, knowing that the faces around the fire showed no inclination toward mercy, only the hard calculation of people who had buried too many of their own children. I will not kill children who have never raised weapons against us, Iron Wolf said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the circle. But neither will I release them to guide more soldiers to our homes. Let them prove their worth among us. If they can survive our ways, if they can contribute to our people's welfare, they earn the right to live. Black Elk spat into the fire, his gesture carrying unmistakable contempt. And if they betray us, if they signal to their people where we make our camps, where our children sleep, then they die. Iron Wolf replied with simple finality. And I die with them, for the choice will be mine to bear. The stark proposal settled the immediate crisis. But Elena could see it had only postponed a reckoning that would come with the changing seasons. Over the following days, she threw herself into learning the customs and language of her captors, with desperate determination, understanding instinctively that knowledge was her only weapon against the suspicion that surrounded her like winter cold. Sparrow became her reluctant teacher, showing her how to move through the camp without giving offense, how to gather firewood without disturbing the animal tracks that served as the village's early warning system, how to prepare food without waste in a community where survival often balanced on razor's edge. The work was brutal by any measure. Elena's soft hands, accustomed to needlework and book pages, quickly blistered from hauling water and scraping hides. Her back ached from bending over cooking fires, and her arms grew sore from carrying small thunder everywhere she went. But she endured without complaint, driven by knowledge that any sign of weakness could mean death for both of them. The other women watched her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that shifted like shadows throughout each day. White Dove, Iron Wolf's wife, treated her with cold indifference that somehow felt worse than outright hostility. Grief had carved deep lines around the woman's eyes and mouth, and her once beautiful hair hung in neglected tangles that spoke of a spirit wounded beyond easy healing. Elena tried to approach her, once hoping that shared experience of caring for children might create some bridge between them. She had been carrying Small Thunder, who was fussing despite her efforts to soothe him with the Czech lullabies her grandmother had taught her. White Dove looked up at the sound, and for a moment Elena saw something flicker in the woman's dark eyes, maternal instinct that transcended race and circumstance. But then White Dove's expression hardened like clay in fire, and she turned away without acknowledgement. Elena understood with painful clarity. To this grieving mother, the white baby represented everything stolen from her own child and the future that would never unfold, the laughter that would never again fill her lodge. As autumn deepened toward winter, and the village settled into survival routines honed by generations of harsh seasons, Elena's trials intensified. Village elders devised tests designed to break her spirit or prove her fundamental uselessness to the community. She was sent to gather medicinal roots in freezing rain that left her shivering and sick for days. She was tasked with crafting tools using techniques she had never seen producing results that were mocked and rejected with casual cruelty. Through it all, Elena persevered with a stubbornness that reminded Iron Wolf of his dead sister. She learned to read weather patterns in the behavior of birds, to find edible plants buried under early snow, to craft rope from prairie grass, with fingers that bled but never stopped working. Her Czech and broken English gradually blended with halting Lakota as she pieced together the language that might save their lives. Small Thunder thrived despite the harsh conditions, his robust constitution strengthened by the crisp prairie air. His ready smiles and innocent laughter began winning over even initial skeptics, and village children would gather around Elena as she worked, fascinated by the pale baby who responded to their games with delighted giggles. During one of these moments, Elena mending winter moccasins while Small Thunder played with Lakota children who had overcome their parents' warnings, she first felt something approaching acceptance. The children saw her not as foreign or threatening, but simply as the girl who told stories in broken Lakota and shared her strange-looking brother's affection freely. But acceptance from children wasn't acceptance from adults, and several incidents that autumn tested Elena's resolve to its very limits. The first came when scouts returned with disturbing news. Soldiers were camped less than a day's ride from the village, asking questions about missing white families and offering rewards for information. Paranoia swept through the camp like prairie fire, and eyes turned inevitably toward Elena, the white girl who might somehow be signaling to her own people. She was dragged before an emergency council session. Accusations flying in rapid Lakota she couldn't fully understand. Sparrow translated the key points with obvious reluctance. They suspected her of somehow communicating with the outside world, of marking trails or leaving signs for soldiers to follow. No. Elena protested, mixing German with her broken English in her distress. I tell soldiers nothing. I not know where they are. I stay in village. I work. I take care of brother. Iron Wolf defended her, pointing out that she had been under constant surveillance since her arrival and had shown no signs of attempting escape or outside communication. But doubt lingered like smoke, and Elena found herself subjected to even closer scrutiny. The second incident proved far more serious. A hunting party was ambushed by soldiers while tracking elk in the foothills, and 2 warriors died in the attack, including young Runs Far, who had been one of the few to show Elena any genuine kindness. When his body was brought back to the village, his mother flew into a rage that shook the very foundations of Elena's precarious position. The white girl brought this curse upon us. Mourning Dove screamed, pointing an accusing finger at Elena, while tears streamed down her face. Since she came among us, we have known only death and sorrow. The spirits are angry that we shelter our enemies' children. The accusation struck deep because it contained just enough truth to be genuinely dangerous. Since Elena's arrival, the village had indeed experienced an unusual string of misfortunes. Game had been scarce, several children had fallen ill with fever, and now soldiers seemed to be circling closer to their territory, like wolves sensing weakness. Elena found herself completely ostracized for the first time since her arrival. Women who had begun tolerating her presence now crossed to the other side of camp when they saw her coming. Warriors muttered threats that needed no translation. Even the children, influenced by their parents' behavior, began keeping their distance from the girl who might bring death to them all. Only Iron Wolf and Sparrow stood between Elena and the growing hostility of the village, and even their protection came at a cost. Other warriors questioned Iron Wolf's judgment openly, and some suggested that his mercy toward the white girl was a sign of weakness that endangered everyone. The crisis reached its peak during the winter solstice ceremony, when Elena had been excluded from the sacred rituals and left alone with Small Thunder in the teepee she shared with Sparrow. But as the ceremony reached its climax, 2 young warriors' brothers who had been drinking firewater obtained from white traders burst into the dwelling with knives drawn and murder in their eyes. Their slurred Lakota was clear enough in intention even to Elena's limited understanding. They had come to end the white girl's curse once and for all, and neither small brother nor tribal politics would stop them. Elena backed against the teepee wall, Small Thunder crying in her arms as she searched desperately for any weapon or escape route. She had none, facing 2 armed men who saw her as the source of all their people's recent troubles. But as the first warrior raised his knife, she found her voice and spoke words that would change everything. "Ayustan yo stop," she shouted in clear Lakota, the command ringing with authority she didn't know she possessed. "You want to kill baby. You want to murder child who never hurt you, never raised hand against your people." The warriors hesitated, surprised by her use of their language and the fierce determination in her voice. Elena pressed her advantage words, tumbling out in a mixture of Lakota and English that somehow conveyed her desperation and absolute refusal to surrender. "I am Wakanyeja child like your own children," she said, pointing to herself with one hand while holding Small Thunder with the other. "This is Small Thunder, my brother, who brings laughter to your own children's games. We are not soldiers, not enemies. We are children who lost parents just like you have lost friends and family. You kill us, you become like the men who killed your people. You become what you hate most. The warriors looked at each other uncertainly, the firewater making them bold, but Elena's words carrying truth that cut through their drunken rage. The baby in her arms looked up at them with wide, trusting eyes that reflected their own children's innocence. And something in that gaze gave them pause. Before either could decide what to do, Iron Wolf burst through the teepee entrance like an avenging spirit. He had heard the commotion and come running, his face dark with fury that promised terrible consequences. Without hesitation, he struck both warriors down with his tomahawk handle, sending them sprawling unconscious across the teepee floor. "Hara. Hanala, enough," he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had reached the end of his patience. "The next person who threatens these children will answer to me personally, and that answer will be given in blood." Elena looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, holding her crying brother close to her chest. In that moment, Iron Wolf saw not a white enemy, but a frightened girl protecting her family with the same fierce determination that had driven him to violence in the first place. "Pilamaya, thank you," Elena whispered in careful Lakota, the words carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. Iron Wolf nodded once, then helped drag the unconscious warriors outside to face the consequences of their actions. But as he left, Elena saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before: respect, perhaps even the beginning of genuine paternal concern. The incident marked a crucial turning point in Elena's integration into Lakota society. Word spread through the village that Iron Wolf had personally intervened to protect the white girl, and his reputation for decisive action discouraged further direct confrontations. But it also deepened the mystery surrounding Elena's place in the community. She existed in a liminal space between acceptance and rejection, neither fully trusted nor completely dismissed. As winter deepened and the village settled into the careful routines of survival, Elena continued her daily struggle to prove her worth. She learned to weave baskets from prairie grass so expertly that even the elder women grudgingly admitted her skill. She mastered the identification of medicinal plants and the preparation of remedies that eased children's winter coughs. Most importantly, she learned to tell stories that made the children laugh, tales of Czech forests and magical sparrows that bridged the gap between her old world and her new one. Small Thunder grew stronger and more animated. With each passing day, his baby sounds beginning to incorporate Lakota syllables, along with his native Czech and the English Elena spoke to him during quiet moments. His presence had become so natural to village life that many people forgot he was anything other than one of their own. But beneath the surface of daily life, tensions continued to simmer, like a pot left too long over coals. Spring would bring new challenges, new tests of Elena's determination to protect her brother and find a permanent place for both of them in this harsh but beautiful world. What Elena didn't know was that among the soldiers who had ambushed the hunting party, there rode a man who had been searching for her since the day she disappeared. A man whose interest in her fate went far beyond simple family loyalty and everything to do with secrets he believed she carried. Colonel Marcus Brennan had spent 3 years building his reputation and his fortune on the frontier, and Elena represented both an opportunity and a threat that he couldn't afford to ignore. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not only Elena's survival skills, but her understanding of loyalty, family, and the true meaning of home. The girl who had once been Pavel Novak's daughter was slowly becoming something new, a bridge between worlds, if she could survive long enough to fulfill that destiny. Spring's first thaw brought more than melting snow and returning birds. It brought a test that would determine once and for all whether Elena had truly earned her place among the Lakota or remained an outsider whose presence endangered everyone she had come to love. The challenge the elders imposed was harsh by any measure: survive 7 days and nights alone on the prairie, with only the most basic supplies keeping both herself and Small Thunder alive, while avoiding the predators, both animal and human, that roamed the territory. It was a trial typically reserved for young warriors approaching manhood modified now, to test whether a white girl could truly claim membership in their community. 7 sunrises. Gray Eagle announced with ceremonial gravity. Knife, blanket, water pouch. Nothing more. Return with both yourself and the child healthy, and you will be considered Wikape waste, a woman of worth among us. Elena received the challenge with a mixture of fear and grim determination. When do I start? Tomorrow at dawn. If you are not back by the 7th sunset, we will assume the prairie has claimed you, and your names will not be spoken again. That night, Elena barely slept, but when dawn came, she found Iron Wolf waiting at the village edge with a small bundle wrapped in soft doe skin. His presence surprised her. She had expected to face this trial completely alone. Things that might help, he said quietly, offering the bundle. Not weapons or food that would violate the terms, but knowledge passed from one survivor to another. Elena unwrapped the bundle to find several precious items, a piece of flint for fire-making, dried sage for purification and medicine, a bone needle with sinew thread for emergency repairs, and most valuable of all, a piece of birch bark covered with simple drawings that showed water sources, edible plants, and dangerous areas within a day's walk of the village. Why? Elena asked, genuinely puzzled by this unexpected assistance. Iron Wolf was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. My son would have faced a similar test at his 15th winter. I would have wanted someone to give him guidance if I could not be there to provide it myself. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. There was no time for emotion now, only survival. She carefully rewrapped the gifts and prepared for what might be the longest week of her life. Small Thunder seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. He was quieter than usual as Elena adjusted the improved cradleboard that White Dove had grudgingly helped her construct, his wide eyes taking in the preparations with the serious attention that babies sometimes brought to important events. 7 days. Gray Eagle reminded her as she reached the village boundary. No help from anyone, no return until the trial is complete. The spirits will judge whether you deserve to remain among us. Elena nodded once, then turned her back on the only security she had known for months and walked into the prairie's vast emptiness with nothing but her wits, her love for her brother, and a determination forged in the fires of loss and survival. The 7 days that followed transformed Elena completely, burning away the last remnants of the frightened Czech girl and forging something harder and more resilient in her place. She faced challenges that tested every skill she had learned, finding shelter during a spring blizzard that turned the world white and deadly, tracking down a black bear that had been following the scent of her small fire, locating water when the obvious sources proved contaminated with the corpses of winter-killed animals. But it was the final night that truly tested her mettle. Wolves had been shadowing her for 2 days, drawn by the scent of Small Thunder and the promise of easy prey. Elena found a rocky outcropping that provided some protection and built the largest fire she could manage, arranging every piece of combustible material she could find in a defensive ring around their position. As darkness fell, she could see their eyes reflecting the flames, at least 6 distinct pairs, possibly more. They tested her defenses throughout the night, darting forward to the fire's edge and forcing her to throw burning brands while maintaining enough fuel to keep the flames alive until dawn. Elena fed the fire everything she had, twigs, dried grass, even strips torn from her precious blanket when the flames threatened to die. Small Thunder somehow slept through most of the ordeal, his tiny body warm against her chest, his steady breathing a reminder of why she had to survive. The longest night of her life finally surrendered to gray dawn, and as the first light crept across the prairie, the wolves melted away, like shadows returning to the spirit world. Elena had survived, but just barely. Her fire was reduced to glowing embers, her supplies were exhausted, and she was running on nothing but willpower. and the fierce determination to return to the village, with her brother safe in her arms. When she walked back into the Lakota camp on the 7th day, exactly as the sun touched the horizon, Elena was no longer the same person who had left. The trial had burned away her last fears and uncertainties, leaving someone who understood that survival was not just about enduring hardship, but about finding strength in the darkest moments and using that strength to protect what mattered most. Gray Eagle examined her and Small Thunder, carefully checking for signs that she might have received help or failed to meet the trial's strict requirements. Finding none, he nodded with something approaching respect. "You have proven yourself worthy of life among the Lakota," he announced to the assembled crowd. "From this day forward, you are Wakanyeja, Waste Good Child. This is your name among us earned through courage and determination." Elena felt tears of relief and joy streaming down her face as the village erupted in celebration. She had not only survived the trial, but earned something she had never dared hope for: genuine acceptance, and a place in the community that no one could question or take away. But her real education in Lakota ways was just beginning. Over the following months, Elena grew into her new identity with determination that impressed even former skeptics. She learned traditional medicine from White Dove, whose grief had begun lifting as she found purpose in teaching. She mastered intricate beadwork that told family stories, hunting techniques that required patience and skill, and the complex social protocols that governed village life. Most importantly, she began to understand the larger forces threatening her adopted people. White settlers pressed steadily westward like an unstoppable tide. Buffalo herds dwindled under systematic slaughter designed to starve the tribes into submission. And government treaties were broken almost as quickly as they were signed, each violation pushing the Lakota closer to a war they could not hope to win. "The world is changing faster than the seasons," Iron Wolf told her during one of their hunting expeditions, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge no leader should have to carry. "Soon, all of us will have to choose what kind of future we want to build, from the ruins of what we're losing." Elena sensed the profound weight behind his words. The fragile peace that Running Deer had worked so hard to maintain was growing more precarious with each passing season. Young warriors spoke increasingly of driving out all white settlers through violence, while the elders counseled patience and diplomatic solutions that seemed less viable with each new encroachment on traditional lands. It was during Elena's 3rd spring with the Lakota that scouts brought news that would shatter her hard-won sense of security. A cavalry unit had been making inquiries at trading posts throughout the territory, asking specific questions about a white girl and baby who had disappeared from a wagon train years earlier, and offering substantial rewards for information leading to their recovery. They claim the girl is the niece of an important military officer, reported Swift Horse, who had been trading at Fort Laramie when the soldiers arrived. They offer more money than most men see in a lifetime for news of her whereabouts. Elena felt ice forming in her stomach as the implications became clear. What kind of officer? A colonel. Colonel Marcus Brennan. He commands the garrison at Fort Mitchell and claims to be searching for his dear niece, who was tragically taken by hostile savages. Elena's knees nearly buckled at the name. Uncle Marcus, her father's brother-in-law, the man who had always made her profoundly uncomfortable with his calculating stares and inappropriate questions about her father's work with various tribes. She had assumed he was dead, or had long since written her off as another casualty of frontier life. His active search suggested motives she didn't want to contemplate. Iron Wolf noticed her reaction immediately, his warrior's instincts reading the fear and recognition in her expression. "You know this man." Elena nodded reluctantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was my uncle by marriage, my father's wife's brother. But they were never close. Papa always said Marcus cared more about military advancement than family. Then why does he search for you now, after so much time has passed?" That question haunted Elena over the following weeks, as traders and scouts brought fragments of information that helped her piece together a disturbing picture. There had been inquiries about Pavel Novak's work as a translator and mediator, questions about his negotiations with various tribes, particular interest in his documentation of treaty discussions and land agreements. Elena began to understand, with horrible clarity. Her father had been more than just a translator working to build bridges between cultures. He had been documenting the systematic violations of treaties by men like Brennan, collecting evidence of the corruption and abuse that characterized most government dealings with native peoples. My father kept detailed records. Elena told Iron Wolf during an emergency council meeting. Papers documenting meetings, copies of letters, testimony from tribal leaders about broken promises. He said someday they would be important for proving the truth about what was being done to the tribes. "Where are these papers now?" Running Deer asked, with the sharp attention of a man who understood the implications. Elena closed her eyes, trying to remember details from the night her family died. He kept them in a metal box wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. The night before we were attacked, he buried it near our wagon. He made me watch the burial so I would know where to find it if something happened to him. The revelation sent shockwaves through the council. If Pavel Novak's papers contained evidence of corruption and systematic treaty violations, they represented a weapon that could destroy careers and potentially lead to criminal charges against powerful men. No wonder Colonel Brennan was so eager to find his missing niece. She was the only person who knew where that evidence was hidden. But Elena's value to Brennan was also her death warrant. Once he recovered the papers and eliminated the evidence of his crimes, he would have no reason to keep her alive, and every reason to ensure her permanent silence. The village council debated their options through the night, voices rising and falling in passionate argument. Some advocated for moving the entire village deeper into Lakota territory, beyond the reach of white soldiers. Others suggested that Elena and Small Thunder should be sent away to live with distant relatives in Canada. A few hardliners proposed a preemptive strike against Brennan's forces before he could organize a major expedition. Elena listened to the debate with growing despair. Every option seemed to require her to abandon either her Lakota family or her blood brother, choices she was not prepared to make. "There is another way," she said finally, when the arguments had grown heated and no clear consensus had emerged. "I could meet with him, pretend to cooperate, learn what he truly wants and how far he's willing to go to get it." The suggestion was met with immediate and vehement opposition. Iron Wolf's face darkened with anger that promised violence. "You would walk voluntarily into the spider's web. This man has spent 3 years hunting you like prey. He will not simply let you walk away once he has you in his grasp. But he doesn't know what I've become." Elena argued with desperate logic. "He expects to find a traumatized girl who has been held captive by savages, someone broken and grateful for rescue. He won't expect someone who has learned to think like a warrior and fight like one of the people." Running Deer studied her with thoughtful eyes that had seen too much of human nature. "What you propose is dangerous beyond measure, child. If you are wrong about his intentions, you will die. If you are right about his intentions, you will also die once he has what he wants from you. Then I make sure he doesn't get what he wants," Elena replied with quiet determination. "And I gather information that might save all of you from what's coming." Elena's plan was risky to the point of insanity, but it had one crucial advantage: it might buy precious time for the village to prepare its defenses or relocate to safety. She would present herself to Brennan as a traumatized captive, desperate to return to white civilization, claiming ignorance about her father's papers, while secretly working to uncover the true scope of his plans and the extent of his criminal network. The council agreed reluctantly with strict conditions that Elena understood might be impossible to fulfill. Iron Wolf and a carefully chosen war party would shadow her movements at a distance, ready to intervene if circumstances permitted. She would carry hidden weapons and prearranged signals for calling for help. Most importantly, if she failed to return within an agreed-upon time frame, the village would assume she was dead and would take whatever actions were necessary to protect themselves. As Elena prepared for what might be her final mission, she spent precious hours with Small Thunder, memorizing every detail of his face and voice. He was too young to understand the danger approaching, but seemed to sense her distress and clung to her more tightly than usual. "Sister sad?" he asked in his endearing mixture of Lakota English and Czech, his small hand patting her cheek with innocent concern. "Sister has to go away for a little while." Elena explained, her voice steady despite the tears she fought to control. "But Sister loves you more than all the stars in the sky. White Dove will take care of you until I come back." "Promise come back?" he asked with the absolute trust that only small children could bring to such questions. Elena looked into her brother's clear blue eyes and felt her heart breaking. She had made many promises over the years, but this one might prove impossible to keep. "I promise to try with everything I have," she said finally. "I promise to fight harder than I've ever fought to come back to you." It was the best she could offer, and somehow it seemed to be enough for Small Thunder. He nodded solemnly and gave her one of his fierce hugs, the kind that seemed to transfer strength from his small body to hers. The next morning, Elena rode toward Fort Mitchell, dressed in the tattered remains of a white woman's dress that Sparrow had obtained from traders years earlier. She had rubbed dirt into her hair and skin to suggest neglect and abuse, practiced walking with the hesitant gait of someone traumatized by years of captivity, and prepared a story that would explain her survival while hiding her true loyalties and capabilities. But as the wooden palisade of Fort Mitchell came into view against the morning sky, Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air. Something was fundamentally wrong. She could sense it in the way the sentries watched her approach, in the excessive number of soldiers visible on the walls, in the general atmosphere of heightened alertness that spoke of preparation for significant action. This was not a rescue operation waiting to unfold. This was a trap already set and waiting for its prey to arrive. Colonel Marcus Brennan was waiting for her in the fort's main administrative building, and Elena's first sight of him confirmed her worst fears. He was older than she remembered, his hair completely gray, and his face marked by the hard lines of a man who had built his career on calculated cruelty. But his eyes were exactly the same, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy or genuine human warmth. "My dear niece," he said, rising from behind his desk with a smile that never reached those predatory eyes. "How profoundly relieved I am to see you alive, and apparently well." Elena forced herself to play her carefully rehearsed role, allowing tears to flow as she stumbled toward him with the unsteady gait of someone whose spirit had been broken by years of trauma. "Uncle Marcus," I thought. I hoped. But I never dared believe I would see a familiar face again. Brennan embraced her briefly, and Elena had to suppress a violent shudder at his touch. Up close, she could smell alcohol on his breath and see the slight tremor in his hands that suggested habitual drinking signs of a man under enormous pressure, whose carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. There," he murmured with practiced sympathy that fooled no one who looked closely enough. "You're completely safe now. Those savages can never hurt you again." Elena pulled back, wiping her eyes with studied care while taking mental inventory of everything she could observe about her surroundings. They killed Mama and Papa right in front of me. I watched them die. I've had nightmares every single night for 3 years. Of course you have, child. Such terrible trauma would mark anyone. Brennan's tone was appropriately sympathetic, but Elena caught the calculating gleam in his eyes. "But tell me what happened to the baby, your little brother." Elena had prepared extensively for this crucial question. But the hungry eagerness in Brennan's voice still made her stomach clench with revulsion. He got sick that first winter. The fever took him before the snows melted. I buried him myself when the ground thawed enough to dig. Brennan's face showed what appeared to be genuine disappointment, though Elena suspected it had more to do with lost leverage and opportunities than grief for a dead child. I'm deeply sorry to hear that, he said with false gravitas. Pavel was exceptionally fond of that boy. He had such plans for his education and future. Yes, Elena whispered, allowing her voice to break slightly. Papa used to talk about all the things he would teach him when he got older, all the places they would explore together. Speaking of your father, Brennan said, his tone becoming more businesslike as he moved toward what Elena suspected was his real objective. I've been attempting to settle his affairs and complete his final reports to the territorial government. There were some papers, official documents related to his work with the Indian tribes. Do you happen to know anything about those? Elena forced herself to look genuinely confused, as if the question made no sense to her traumatized mind. Papers? What kind of papers, Uncle? Official correspondence, treaty records, documentation of meetings and negotiations, that sort of bureaucratic material. They would be quite important for completing his final reports and ensuring that his work receives proper recognition. The lie was smoothly delivered, but Elena could see the tension around Brennan's eyes and the way his hands clenched slightly when he spoke. He was fishing carefully, trying to determine how much she knew without revealing too much about his own desperate need for those documents. I don't know about any papers, Elena said slowly, as if struggling to remember through layers of trauma. Papa never talked to me about his work. He always said it was too complicated and boring for children to understand. Brennan studied her face with the intensity of a predator evaluating wounded prey, searching for any signs of deception or hidden knowledge. Elena maintained her expression of innocent confusion, while her mind raced through contingency plans and potential escape routes. Well, Brennan said finally, apparently satisfied for the moment. Perhaps the memories will return as you continue to heal. Trauma can affect the mind in peculiar ways, blocking out important information until the person feels safe enough to remember. Elena nodded gratefully, playing the part of a rescued captive, eager to please her savior. I hope so, Uncle. I want to help however I can. For now, we need to focus on your immediate needs. Brennan continued, calling for an orderly to escort her to temporary quarters. You'll need proper clothing, decent food, medical attention. We'll have you back to civilization in no time. But as Elena was led through the fort's corridors toward her assigned room, she noticed several things that confirmed her worst suspicions about Brennan's true intentions. The soldiers who watched her moved with the careful attention of guards rather than protectors. The room she was given had bars on the windows that were clearly designed to keep people inside rather than keep danger outside. Most tellingly, she was politely but firmly informed that she was not permitted to leave the fort grounds under any circumstances. She was not a rescued niece receiving medical care and protection. She was a prisoner being held for interrogation and eventual disposal. That night, as Elena lay on the narrow cot in her locked room, she reviewed everything she had learned during her first day at Fort Mitchell. Brennan was clearly desperate to locate her father's papers, which suggested they contained evidence damaging enough to destroy his career and possibly send him to prison. He was also paranoid enough to lock her up, despite her apparent ignorance, which meant he suspected she knew more than she was admitting. But perhaps most ominously, his questions about Small Thunder suggested that her brother's existence was somehow crucial to his plans. Elena had lied about the boy's death to protect him, but she needed to understand why Brennan considered a 3-year-old child so important to his schemes. The answer began to emerge the next day, during what Brennan euphemistically called a debriefing session, but which felt increasingly like a careful interrogation. As Elena repeated her story of captivity and survival, weaving in details designed to make her sound traumatized and confused, Brennan began revealing more about his true motivations. Your father was involved in some very sensitive negotiations before his tragic death, Brennan said, pacing behind his desk like a caged predator. Treaties and agreements that could significantly affect the future development of this entire territory. If he documented those negotiations thoroughly, those papers could prove extremely valuable to the right people. What kind of valuable, Uncle? Elena asked with feigned innocence. Brennan's smile was sharp and predatory. The kind that could make certain individuals very wealthy indeed, my dear. Wealthy enough to leave this godforsaken frontier behind and live in comfort back east. Elena began to understand the scope of his corruption. Her father's papers didn't just contain evidence of treaty violations, they contained detailed information about mineral deposits and natural resources on Lakota lands intelligence that Brennan wanted to exploit for massive personal profit. He had orchestrated her parents' deaths, not just to silence a troublesome mediator, but to steal valuable information that could make him rich beyond imagination. Papa never mentioned anything about being wealthy, Elena said, carefully probing for more information. Your father was a naive idealist, Brennan replied with undisguised contempt. He actually believed in helping those savages keep their worthless hunting grounds. Can you imagine such foolishness sitting on potential fortunes in gold and silver, and he wanted to preserve it for buffalo and primitive rituals? The casual cruelty in his voice made Elena's hands clench beneath the table, but she forced herself to maintain her innocent facade. This man had orchestrated the murder of her parents for money, then spent 3 years hunting her to cover up his crimes and claim his prize. Over the following days, Elena played her role with desperate precision, gradually remembering small details about her father's work, while continuing to claim ignorance about any hidden documents. She allowed Brennan to believe he was slowly breaking down her psychological defenses through a combination of kindness and pressure, while secretly gathering intelligence about his forces, his plans, and the full scope of his criminal operations. What she learned was absolutely terrifying. Brennan commanded not just the soldiers at Fort Mitchell, but an extensive network of corrupt officials, dishonest contractors, and hired mercenaries who shared his vision of exploiting native lands for personal enrichment. He had been systematically undermining peace negotiations for years, using provocations and false flag operations to justify military actions against various tribes. The attack on Elena's family had been just one calculated move in a much larger campaign designed to destabilize the entire region and create pretexts for seizing valuable territory. If he succeeded in finding Pavel's papers and the detailed information they contained about mineral deposits, he would have everything necessary to launch a comprehensive war of extermination disguised as legitimate military action. But Elena's most chilling discovery came through pure accident. An overheard conversation between Brennan and his aide, Lieutenant Morrison, that revealed the final pieces of his horrific puzzle. She had been taking dinner in Brennan's office as part of his strategy to make her feel comfortable and trusting, when Morrison entered with urgent news, failing to notice that the door hadn't closed completely behind him. Sir, we have a significant problem, Morrison said in a low voice that carried clearly to Elena's hiding spot. Running Bear has arrived with his war party, and he's demanding immediate payment for services rendered. Elena felt ice water flooding her veins. Running Bear, she knew that name from village conversations. He was one of the corrupt Lakota who had been secretly collaborating with white authorities for years, a man despised by traditional leaders like Running Deer and Iron Wolf. What exactly does he want? Brennan asked with obvious irritation. He says the girl has been living with Iron Wolf's band for the past 3 years, fully integrated into their society. He can lead us directly to their village, but he wants the gold you promised him for information about the Novak papers. Elena's world collapsed around her as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Running Bear hadn't just been passing along general information about tribal movements. He had been specifically tasked with monitoring her learning about her integration into Lakota society and discovering what she knew about her father's hidden documents. And what did you tell him about our current situation? Brennan pressed. That the girl claims the baby is dead and insists she knows nothing about any papers. He found that quite amusing, sir. He says she's lying about both matters. Elena gripped the edge of her chair to keep from crying out in horror. If Running Bear had been watching her for 3 years, he would know about Small Thunder's survival, about her acceptance into the tribe, about everything she had tried desperately to hide. Does he know the actual location where the papers are buried? He believes the girl knows exactly where they are, but says she's been trained to resist questioning by her savage captors. He strongly recommends more intensive interrogation methods. The conversation continued, revealing details that made Elena's blood run cold. Running Bear would poison the tribal council during their next evening meeting, eliminating the peace faction leadership in one coordinated strike. In the chaos that followed, Brennan's soldiers would attack the village under the pretext of rescuing Elena and recovering stolen military property. Most of the Lakota would resist this invasion and would have to be killed in the ensuing battle. Elena sat frozen in her chair as the horrible truth crashed over her like an avalanche. Everything, her family's murder, her years of captivity, her integration into Lakota society, even the love and acceptance she had found. But all of it had been orchestrated by Brennan as part of an elaborate scheme to steal valuable resources from native lands while eliminating inconvenient witnesses. She was not a survivor who had found a new home among the Lakota. She was an unwitting weapon that had been carefully placed to destroy the people who had saved her life. But Brennan had one final cruelty to inflict, one last twist of the knife that would shatter her completely. There's something else you should understand about your situation, my dear. He told her that evening, apparently deciding that direct psychological assault would be more effective than continued manipulation. Something about your precious iron wolf that might interest you. Elena looked up from her untouched dinner, sensing fresh torment in his predatory smile. He didn't spare your life out of mercy or compassion that morning. Brennan continued with evident satisfaction. Running Bear had already informed him exactly who you were, Pavel Novak's daughter, the key to locating papers that could threaten our entire operation. You were allowed to live because you were a valuable asset, not because anyone felt genuine sympathy for your plight. Elena felt as if the ground was dissolving beneath her feet. That's not true, isn't it? Why do you think you were so readily accepted into their primitive society? Why do you think Iron Wolf took such personal interest in your training and development? You weren't a rescued captive, Elena. You were a carefully cultivated intelligence source, being groomed to serve your captor's long-term interests. The words hit Elena like physical blows, undermining everything she had believed about her place in the world and the relationships that had sustained her through years of hardship. Was it possible that Iron Wolf's protection had been motivated by calculation rather than genuine care? Had White Dove's friendship been part of an elaborate deception designed to gain her trust? You're lying, she whispered. But doubt was already creeping into her heart like poison. Am I then? Why hasn't Iron Wolf attempted to return you to your own people where you obviously belong? Why hasn't he tried to negotiate some kind of ransom or exchange? Could it be because he needed you exactly where you were close enough to trust, but never close enough to suspect the truth about your real value to him? Elena's entire understanding of her life among the Lakota was crumbling beneath the weight of Brennan's revelations. Every moment of kindness, every gesture of acceptance, every expression of what she had believed was genuine affection, all of it might have been an elaborate performance designed to manipulate her emotions and extract information. But even through her despair, a small voice in her mind whispered that something didn't add up in Brennan's version of events. If Iron Wolf had known her true identity from the very beginning, why had he seemed so conflicted about sparing her life? Why had the tribal council been genuinely divided about whether to accept her into their community? Why had her survival trials been real tests of endurance and skill, rather than carefully orchestrated performances? I can see you're struggling to process this information, Brennan said with false sympathy that made her skin crawl. It's always painful to learn that the people we trust have been using us for their own purposes. But don't worry about your confusion. It will all be over very soon. He nodded to Morrison, who stepped forward and placed his hand on the grip of his holstered pistol with practiced casualness. "Wait," Elena said desperately, grasping for any possible delay. "You promised that Small Thunder would be spared if I cooperated." "I'm afraid I lied about that as well," Brennan replied with casual cruelty. "The boy dies tonight, along with the rest of his savage protectors. You die now because keeping you alive any longer serves no useful purpose." Elena closed her eyes and thought of her brother's trusting face, of Iron Wolf's stern but caring guidance, of White Dove's patient teaching, of all the small moments of joy and belonging she had experienced during her years with the Lakota. Real or calculated, genuine or performed, those experiences had shaped her into someone stronger than the frightened girl who had begged for mercy beside a burned wagon. When she opened her eyes, Elena was no longer thinking like a victim waiting for rescue. She was thinking like a Lakota warrior preparing for battle. "Narson," she said with deadly calm, "before you murder me, there's something your colonel hasn't told you about this entire operation." Morrison's finger moved toward his trigger, but Elena's words made him hesitate slightly, exactly the opening she needed. "Ask him about the real value of those papers he's so desperate to find," she continued urgently. "Ask him how much of the gold and silver he's planning to steal will actually make its way to the soldiers who do his killing for him." She could see uncertainty flickering in Morrison's eyes as her words struck home. These were not fundamentally evil men, just career soldiers following orders from a superior they had trusted. Ask him about his business partners back east, the ones who will claim legal ownership of mineral rights after you've cleared the land of its inconvenient inhabitants. On the start, Elena pressed, sensing an opportunity. "Ask him how much blood money you'll receive for committing genocide on behalf of corrupt businessmen who will get rich while you get nothing but nightmares." Morrison's weapon wavered as doubt began to take root. "Colonel, what is she talking about? She's trying to save her worthless life by turning us against each other." Brennan snapped, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Don't listen to the lies of a savage-loving traitor." Elena could see the seeds of suspicion taking hold in Morrison's mind as he began to question aspects of their mission that had never made complete sense. But before she could exploit this advantage further, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the fort's courtyard. Running Bear had arrived to collect his payment and finalize the betrayal that would destroy Elena's adoptive family. But what happened next would prove that even the most carefully laid plans could be undone by the unpredictable power of human conscience and the bonds that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. Elena's escape came not through her own efforts, but through an unexpected act of redemption from the most unlikely source imaginable. As Brennan and Morrison hurried outside to meet with Running Bear, leaving Elena momentarily unguarded, a figure slipped into the room. Through the window she had assumed was securely barred. Sparrow, the Lakota woman who had been Elena's first teacher and reluctant translator, moved with the silent grace of someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding detection by enemies. "Inilayo, be quiet," she whispered urgently in Lakota. "I have little time to explain, but Iron Wolf sent me to bring you home." Elena stared at her in shock, her mind struggling to process this impossible rescue. "How did you get inside the fort? How did you even know where to find me?" "Running Bear is not the only Lakota who can move unseen among white soldiers," Sparrow replied grimly. "Some of us have been watching him for months, waiting for him to reveal the full scope of his treachery." As Sparrow worked to free Elena from her bonds, she explained in rapid whispers how Iron Wolf had suspected Running Bear's duplicity for years, but had lacked concrete proof until Elena's disappearance. The war chief had sent scouts to monitor the fort, and they had observed enough to piece together the basic outline of Brennan's plan. "Iron Wolf knows you did not abandon us willingly," Sparrow said, addressing the doubts that Brennan had planted in Elena's mind. "He knows you came here to protect the village, even though it meant walking into obvious danger." Elena felt tears of relief streaming down her face as the psychological torture of the past few days began to lift. Then, he doesn't believe I'm just a tool to be used. Sparrow's weathered face softened with something approaching maternal affection. Child Iron Wolf grieved when you left, as if he had lost another daughter. White Dove has been preparing for war ever since, determined to rescue you or die in the attempt. Do you think we would risk so much for someone we did not truly love? The simple truth of those words cut through all of Brennan's lies and manipulation, restoring Elena's faith in the relationships that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her life. But there was no time for extended emotional reunion. Outside, Elena could hear Brennan's voice, raised in angry argument with Running Bear, suggesting that their alliance was beginning to fracture under the pressure of mutual suspicion and greed. "We must leave now before they discover you are missing," Sparrow said urgently. "Iron Wolf and the war party are waiting beyond the hills, but we must reach them before Brennan realizes what has happened." Elena nodded, following Sparrow toward the window through which she had entered, but as they prepared to escape, Elena made a decision that would change everything. "Wait," she said, grabbing Sparrow's arm. "I know where my father's papers are buried. If we leave them for Brennan to find, he'll have everything he needs to destroy not just our village, but every Lakota community in the territory." Sparrow looked at her with surprise and growing alarm. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we get there first," Elena replied with grim determination. "Those papers contain evidence of Brennan's crimes, proof that could send him to prison and expose the entire conspiracy. But they also contain information about gold deposits that he absolutely cannot be allowed to possess." Elena quickly explained her plan. It was dangerous and would require perfect timing, but it offered the only realistic chance of stopping Brennan permanently rather than simply delaying his inevitable assault on the Lakota communities. Sparrow listened with the intensity of a warrior evaluating battle plans, then nodded slowly. "It could work, but if we fail, both of us will die, and our people will be left defenseless against what is coming. If we do nothing, they'll die anyway," Elena replied simply. "At least this way we have a chance to save them." The two women slipped out of Fort Mitchell under cover of darkness, moving with the stealth that only those trained in Lakota hunting techniques could manage. Behind them, Elena could hear Brennan's voice growing increasingly agitated as his meeting with Running Bear deteriorated into mutual accusations and threats. They reached the grove of cottonwood trees, where Pavel Novak had buried his life's work just as the moon reached its zenith, providing enough light to work, but not enough to expose them to casual observation. Elena located the distinctive boulder that marked the burial site and began digging with desperate urgency, her hands tearing at the earth as if she could undo 3 years of tragedy through sheer force of will. The metal box was exactly where her father had left it, wrapped in oilcloth and containing documents that could reshape the balance of power across the entire frontier. Elena opened it with trembling hands, confirming that the papers were intact and readable. But instead of taking them back to safety, as Sparrow expected, Elena made a choice that her companion couldn't have anticipated. "Hetzesin Snai, no," Sparrow protested as Elena began sorting through the documents. "We must leave immediately before they discover our escape." "We will," Elena said grimly. "But first, I need to make sure Brennan gets exactly what he deserves." Working by moonlight, Elena carefully separated the papers into 2 groups. The first contained her father's evidence of treaty violations, corruption, and systematic abuse documentation that could destroy Brennan's career and expose the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. The second group contained the detailed maps and mineral surveys that Brennan desperately wanted for his own enrichment. Elena handed the evidence of corruption to Sparrow for safekeeping, then did something that made her companion gasp in shock. She struck a spark with flint and steel, setting fire to the mineral surveys and watching years of her father's geological work burn away in the prairie wind. "You're destroying valuable information that could help our people," Sparrow protested. But I'm destroying information that would definitely help our enemies. Elena corrected. Those maps show exactly where to dig for gold and silver on Lakota lands. In the right hands, they could be used to negotiate fair compensation for mineral rights. In Brennan's hands, they would be used to justify genocide. As the flames consumed the last of the mineral surveys, Elena felt as if she was finally laying her father's ghost to rest. Pavel Novak had gathered that information in the hope of protecting Native people's rights. But Elena understood that in the current political climate, such detailed intelligence would more likely be used as a weapon against the very people it was meant to protect. Now we run, Elena said as the fire died down to glowing embers. And we pray that Iron Wolf is ready for the war that's coming. The two women mounted horses that Sparrow had hidden nearby and rode hard toward the rendezvous point where Iron Wolf and his warriors waited. Behind them, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep across the horizon, and Elena knew it wouldn't be long before Brennan discovered her escape and began pursuit. But as they crested a hill that provided a view of the surrounding prairie, Elena's heart sank into her boots. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from multiple points, not the thin wisps of cooking fires, but the thick, black columns that spoke of buildings and perhaps entire communities burning. They're already attacking, Sparrow said with quiet despair. We're too late to prevent it. Elena stared at the distant smoke plumes, her mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. Brennan had apparently decided to move forward with his assault, even without recovering the papers, possibly because Running Bear had convinced him that he could force the information from captured villagers. No, Elena said with sudden determination. We're not too late. We're exactly where we need to be. She wheeled her horse around and began riding not toward safety, but directly toward the largest smoke plume toward the village, where Small Thunder and everyone she loved were fighting for their lives against impossible odds. Where are you going? Sparrow called after her. To finish what my father started, Elena replied without slowing. And to make sure Brennan pays for every life he's destroyed. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Elena was no longer running from her destiny. She was riding straight toward it, with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. The village was a scene from Elena's worst nightmares as she and Sparrow approached from the eastern hills. Smoke rose from burned teepees, while the sound of gunfire echoed across the prairie like deadly thunder. Brennan's forces had surrounded the community with military precision, using portable artillery to devastate the Lakota defenses, while cavalry units prevented any escape. But as Elena studied the battlefield with eyes trained by Iron Wolf himself, she realized that the situation was not yet hopeless. The Lakota warriors had fought with desperate skill, turning every available structure into a fortress and making the attacking soldiers pay dearly for every yard of ground they gained. Bodies in blue uniforms were scattered throughout the village, proof that Brennan's mercenaries were facing fiercer resistance than they had expected. There, Sparrow pointed toward a cluster of teepees near the village center, where Elena could see familiar figures moving among the defenders. Iron Wolf still holds the heart of the village. If we can reach him. Elena nodded, but her attention was focused on a different part of the battlefield. On a rise overlooking the village, she could see Brennan himself directing the assault from what he considered a safe distance. He was surrounded by his staff officers and a small guard unit, apparently confident that his overwhelming firepower would soon crush all resistance. I'm going after Brennan, Elena announced, checking the weapons Sparrow had brought for her escape. Now that's suicide, Sparrow protested. He has too many soldiers protecting him. Maybe. Elena agreed. But I'm the only one who can get close enough to try. He thinks I'm safely locked up in his fort, so he won't be expecting me to appear on the battlefield. Elena quickly outlined her plan. It was desperate and relied heavily on timing and luck. But it offered the only realistic chance of ending the battle before everyone she loved was killed. Sparrow listened with the attention of a warrior who understood that sometimes the most dangerous plans were also the most necessary. When Elena finished explaining, the older woman nodded grimly. If you can create enough confusion among their leadership, our warriors might be able to break through their lines. Sparrow agreed. But you'll need to get much closer than seems possible. Then I'd better start moving. Elena began working her way around the battlefield's perimeter, using every technique Iron Wolf had taught her about moving unseen across hostile territory. The skills that had once helped her avoid wolves and bears now served to keep her hidden from human predators who were far more dangerous. As she moved closer to Brennan's command post, Elena could hear fragments of conversation that revealed the true scope of his desperation. The assault was not going according to plan. His forces were taking heavy casualties, his artillery was running low on ammunition, and several of his mercenary units were beginning to question whether the promised payment was worth the extraordinary risks they were facing. "Sir, perhaps we should consider a tactical withdrawal," Lieutenant Morrison was saying, as Elena crept close enough to hear clearly. "We've underestimated their defensive capabilities, and the men are beginning to lose confidence." "Absolutely not," Brennan snapped. "We're too close to victory to retreat now. Order the artillery to concentrate fire on the central cluster of buildings. I want those savages roasted alive." Elena felt rage building in her chest as she listened to this casual discussion of mass murder. These men were talking about killing Small Thunder, Iron Wolf, White Dove, and everyone else who had shown her kindness, as if their lives were nothing more than obstacles to be cleared away. But she also heard opportunity in their words. Brennan's forces were wavering, held together primarily by his personal authority and the promise of rich rewards. If she could shatter that authority at a crucial moment, the entire assault might collapse. Elena worked her way closer to the command post, taking advantage of the noise and confusion of battle to mask her movements. She could see Brennan clearly now, standing with his back to her as he studied the village through a field telescope. Morrison and 2 other officers flanked him, while a small squad of guards maintained a loose perimeter around their position. This was her chance, possibly the only one she would get. Elena drew the knife that Sparrow had given her and prepared to charge Brennan's position. But before she could move, she heard a sound that stopped her cold. Small Thunder was crying somewhere in the village below his distinctive voice, carrying above the noise of battle like a beacon of everything she was fighting to protect. The sound of her brother's distress ignited something primal and unstoppable in Elena's chest. She was no longer thinking tactically or strategically. She was simply a sister whose family was in mortal danger. "Brennan," she shouted, stepping into the open with her knife raised. "Turn around and face me, you murdering coward." The colonel spun around, his eyes widening with shock and rage as he saw the girl who was supposed to be safely locked in his fort. "How did you, Morrison, kill her? Kill her now." But Morrison hesitated, his weapon half drawn, as doubt clouded his features. Elena's presence on the battlefield made no sense unless everything she had told him about Brennan's true motives was accurate. Elena pressed her advantage, speaking not to Brennan, but to the soldiers who surrounded him. "Look around you. Look at how many of your friends are dead, because this man wants to steal gold from people who never hurt you. Ask yourselves how much of that gold you'll actually see once the killing is done." "She's lying," Brennan snarled, drawing his own pistol. "She's been corrupted by years of savage influence. Don't listen to her poison." But Elena could see uncertainty spreading among the soldiers as they began to question what they were really fighting for. These were not evil men, just professionals following orders from a superior they had trusted. "I have documents that prove everything." Elena continued, holding up the papers that Sparrow had given her. "Evidence of your colonel's crimes, proof that he's been stealing government money and using you to commit murder for his personal profit." Brennan's face went white as he recognized the threat those papers represented. Without hesitation, he raised his pistol and fired the bullet, catching Elena in the shoulder and spinning her to the ground. Pain exploded through her body. But Elena's training with the Lakota had taught her to function despite injury. As she fell, she managed to scatter her father's papers across the hilltop, ensuring that even if she died, the evidence of Brennan's crimes would survive. "Gather those papers," Brennan screamed at his men. "Burn them all." But as the soldiers moved to obey, another voice cut across the battlefield with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Stand down. All of you, stand down immediately." Elena looked up through pain-blurred vision to see a blue-uniformed officer she didn't recognize riding up the hill with a company of cavalry behind him. His insignia marked him as a major, and his bearing suggested someone with legitimate authority rather than the corrupt opportunists who followed Brennan. "Major Henderson." Brennan said, his voice tight with poorly concealed panic. "I wasn't expecting you for another week." "Obviously." Henderson replied coldly as he dismounted and began examining the scattered papers. "Stand down your forces, Colonel. This engagement is terminated immediately." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Major. These savages are holding my niece captive, and your niece is lying wounded on this hilltop because you shot her." Henderson interrupted his voice, carrying across the battlefield with unmistakable authority. "And these documents appear to contain rather interesting information about your unauthorized activities in this territory." Elena watched through a haze of pain and exhaustion as the careful structure of Brennan's conspiracy began to collapse around him. Henderson had apparently been sent to investigate reports of corruption and illegal activities, reports that had likely been triggered by her father's earlier communications with honest officials in Washington. "Morrison," Henderson commanded, "place Colonel Brennan under arrest for misappropriation of government resources, unauthorized military action, and suspicion of murder." "Sir, I don't understand." Morrison replied, his confusion evident in every word. "You will," Henderson assured him. Miss Novak's father was a federal investigator, gathering evidence about corruption in territorial administration. These papers contain enough proof to send several people to prison for very long terms. Elena felt a wave of pride and vindication wash over her as the truth about her father's work finally emerged. Pavel Novak had not been just a translator and peace mediator. He had been an undercover agent working to expose the systematic corruption that was poisoning relationships between the government and native tribes. As Henderson's soldiers moved to secure the battlefield and arrest Brennan's co-conspirators, Elena's vision began to fade from blood loss and exhaustion. But before unconsciousness claimed her, she heard one more sound that made everything worthwhile. Small Thunder's voice calling for his sister as Iron Wolf carried him up the hill toward her. "Tanksy's sister," the little boy cried, reaching out with his small hands as if he could somehow heal her injuries through the power of his love. Elena smiled despite her pain, knowing that she had kept her promise to fight her way back to him. The battle was over, the truth had been revealed, and the people she loved were safe. Everything else could wait until she woke up. Elena's recovery took place not in a military hospital, but in Iron Wolf's teepee, surrounded by the people who had become her true family. Major Henderson had honored her request to remain with the Lakota, while she healed, recognizing that separating her from Small Thunder would cause more trauma than her physical injuries. As consciousness returned in fragments over several days, Elena pieced together what had happened after her confrontation with Brennan. The corrupt colonel was in military custody, facing courts-martial for a dozen serious charges. His network of conspirators was being systematically dismantled, and the mineral rights he had tried to steal were being returned to legitimate tribal control. 5 days. White Dove informed her when Elena finally woke fully. We feared the bullet had done more damage than our medicines could heal." Elena tried to sit up, but White Dove gently pushed her back down. Rest. Your body needs time to rebuild what it lost. Small thunder. Elena asked, her voice hoarse from disuse, playing with the other children by the river as always. White Dove replied with a smile. He visits you every hour to make sure you're still breathing. Iron Wolf finally had to promise him you would wake up, or the boy would never have left your side. Over the following days, as Elena's strength gradually returned, she learned more about the dramatic changes sweeping through the territory. Major Henderson had been sent by officials in Washington who had been building a case against territorial corruption for months using evidence that Pavel Novak had secretly transmitted before his death. Your father was braver than any of us realized. Henderson explained during one of his visits to check on Elena's progress. He volunteered for an extremely dangerous assignment, knowing that exposing men like Brennan might cost him his life. Elena felt tears prick her eyes as she finally understood the full scope of her father's sacrifice. Pavel Novak had not been an innocent victim caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been a federal agent who had died protecting the very people his daughter had learned to love. What happens now? Elena asked. Now we tried to build something better from the ruins of what was destroyed. Henderson replied. The new territorial administration is committed to honest dealing with the tribes, and there are opportunities for people who can serve as bridges between communities. Elena understood the implication. Henderson was offering her a chance to continue her father's work using her unique position and experiences to help prevent future tragedies. But she also had other considerations to weigh. Small Thunder had thrived among the Lakota, and she couldn't bear the thought of uprooting him from the only stable home he had ever known. More than that, she had found her own place in this community, not as a rescued captive or a strategic asset, but as a genuine member of an extended family that had accepted her completely. I need time to think, Elena said finally. Of course, Henderson replied. There's no pressure to decide immediately. The opportunities will remain available when you're ready. Elena's decision came not through careful deliberation, but through a simple moment of clarity that arrived unexpectedly. She was helping Small Thunder practice his English words when he looked up with his serious 4-year-old expression and asked, Sister, why do some people have different color skin? Elena realized that her brother was beginning to notice racial differences, to ask the questions that would shape his understanding of his place in a complex world. How she answered those questions would influence not just his individual development, but potentially the broader relationships between the communities that had shaped them both. Because the world is big and beautiful and full of many different kinds of people, she said carefully. And different doesn't mean better or worse. It just means interesting and special. Small Thunder nodded solemnly, processing this information with the intense concentration children brought to important concepts. Are we different people or same people as everyone else? Elena looked at his face, Czech features but sun-darkened skin, blue eyes, but black hair braided in Lakota style, speaking 3 languages fluently before his 5th birthday. He was already living the answer to his own question, embodying the possibility of bridging different worlds. We're both, she said with sudden certainty. We're the same and different, and that makes us exactly what the world needs. That night, Elena made her decision. The treaty ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning 6 months later, with representatives from the U.S. government and the Lakota Nation gathered in the meadow where Elena had once survived her wilderness trial. The symbolism was not lost on her. This was the place where she had first truly understood what it meant to fight for family, and now it would witness the formal recognition of new possibilities for cooperation between peoples. Major Henderson read the treaty terms in English, while Running Deer translated into Lakota, their voices carrying across the assembled crowd with hope that had been rare in recent years. Elena stood with Iron Wolf's family Small Thunder, balanced on her hip, listening to words that would reshape everyone's future. The agreement was imperfect, as all human compromises must be. The Lakota would retain control of their sacred sites and substantial hunting grounds, but would also accept regulated white settlement in designated areas and allow construction of roads and telegraph lines through portions of their territory. More importantly for Elena, the treaty included unprecedented provisions for mixed families and cultural exchange. There would be schools where children from both communities could learn together, trading posts that would be jointly managed by representatives from each group, and official positions for interpreters and mediators who could help prevent the misunderstandings that had led to so much violence. When the formal ceremonies concluded, Elena found herself face to face with Henderson and a distinguished gentleman in civilian clothes, who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to significant authority. "Miss Novak," Henderson said, "I'd like you to meet Commissioner Williams from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He's traveled all the way from Washington to discuss the opportunities we mentioned." Commissioner Williams extended his hand with a warm smile that seemed genuine rather than calculated. "Miss Novak, your reputation precedes you. Major Henderson has told me remarkable things about your experiences and unique capabilities." Elena shook his hand cautiously, still wary of trusting government officials despite Henderson's apparent honesty. "What specific opportunities are you offering?" she asked directly. "We're establishing an experimental school," Williams explained with obvious enthusiasm. "Not just for Indian children, and not just for white children, but for children from both communities learning together. The goal is to create genuine understanding between cultures rather than forcing one culture to disappear into the other." Elena felt her heart quicken with interest. "Where would this school be located?" "Here, actually. On the boundary between the reservation lands and the nearest white settlement. It would serve both communities equally and be governed by representatives from each. You would be the head teacher with complete authority to design curricula that honor both traditions while preparing children for a future that will require them to navigate multiple cultural contexts." Elena looked down at Small Thunder, who was listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus that 4-year-olds brought to discussions they sensed were important, even if they couldn't understand all the words. "And my brother, he would be one of your first students," Williams said with a smile. "Though I suspect he might also end up being one of your most effective teachers. Children like him, who move naturally between different worlds, often understand things that adults struggle to grasp." Elena felt pieces of a complex puzzle clicking into place. This was the path she had been unconsciously seeking, a way to honor both her birth heritage and her chosen family, to use her painful experiences to benefit both communities, to raise Small Thunder with full knowledge of all the cultures that had shaped his identity. "I'm very interested," she said, "but I have several conditions that must be met." Williams raised an eyebrow with what appeared to be amused respect. "Such as, the school must be truly equal in every sense. Not white children being taught to tolerate Indians, or Indian children being taught to abandon their traditions. Both cultures must be presented with equal respect and given equal time in the curriculum." "Absolutely agreed. I want Iron Wolf and White Dove involved in developing the educational program. Their knowledge and perspectives are as valuable as any university training. Of course, their participation would be essential to the school's success. And I want ironclad guarantees that this school will never be used as a tool for forced assimilation. The goal must always be understanding and cooperation, never cultural erasure." Williams nodded slowly, apparently impressed by her thoroughness. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss Novak. But yes, I agree to all your conditions. When can you start?" Elena looked around at the faces surrounding her Iron Wolf with his stern pride and hidden warmth, White Dove with her gentle wisdom and recovered joy, Running Deer with his diplomatic patience and hard-earned hope, Small Thunder with his innocent trust and unlimited potential. These people had saved her life in every way that mattered, had given her a home. When she had nowhere else to go had shown her what it meant to be part of something larger and more important than individual survival. "I can start immediately," she said, "but I'll need sufficient time to prepare properly. Good teaching requires careful planning and extensive consultation." Over the following months, Elena threw herself into building her revolutionary school with the same determination she had once brought to surviving in the wilderness. She traveled to distant cities to study the latest educational theories, corresponded with teachers who had experience working with diverse student populations, and most importantly, spent countless hours with elders from both communities, learning the stories and traditions she would need to pass on to her students. The school building itself became a symbol of the cooperation it was designed to foster. White carpenters worked alongside Lakota craftsmen, creating a structure that blended architectural traditions in ways that reflected the institution's fundamental mission. The result was both beautiful and functional, with large windows that filled the spaces with natural light and flexible arrangements that could accommodate both formal classroom instruction and the more informal teaching methods preferred by many native educators. Elena's first class consisted of 12 students ranging in age from 5 to 15, representing both communities and several mixed families like her own. Small Thunder, now a remarkably articulate 5-year-old, who switched effortlessly between 3 languages, was simultaneously her youngest student and one of her most effective teaching assistants. The challenges were significant and sometimes seemed overwhelming. Some white parents worried that their children were learning savage ways that would handicap them in civilized society, while some Lakota parents feared that traditional knowledge was being diluted or misrepresented for white consumption. Elena found herself constantly negotiating between different expectations and concerns, using diplomatic skills learned through years of surviving between cultures. But there were also moments of pure magic that made all the difficulties worthwhile, like the day when 10-year-old Sarah Mitchell, daughter of white homesteaders, taught 5-year-old Running Fox how to write his name in English, while he showed her how to identify medicinal plants by their leaves and scent. Or the afternoon when Elena's students performed a play they had written themselves, telling the story of first contact between Europeans and native peoples using dialogue in both English and Lakota, with costumes that reflected both cultural traditions. The school's innovative approach attracted attention from educators and government officials across the country. Elena received invitations to conferences and meetings requests to write articles about her methods and educational philosophy. She declined most of these opportunities, preferring to focus on her students and her immediate community, but accepted a few chances to speak about the importance of cultural understanding in preparing children for an increasingly interconnected world. It was during one of these speaking engagements in Chicago that Elena received news that would bring her personal story full circle in the most unexpected way. She was staying at a hotel near the conference venue when a clerk approached with a telegram that had been forwarded from the school. Elena opened it with mild curiosity, expecting routine administrative business or perhaps a message from one of the government officials she worked with. Instead, she found herself staring at words that made her knees weak with shock. "Dear Miss Novak, stop received your name from Commissioner Williams. Stop believe we may be related. Stop my name is Anna Svoboda. Stop I am your father's sister. Stop thought all family died in America. Stop please respond if this reaches you stop." Elena read the telegram 3 times before the words fully registered. Her father had a sister family she had never known, existed relatives who had survived in the old country while she was building a new life on the American frontier. That evening, Elena sat in her hotel room and composed the longest letter of her life, describing everything that had happened since her family had left Bohemia so many years ago. She wrote about the journey to America, the attack on their wagon train, her years with the Lakota, her confrontation with Brennan, and her current work at the experimental school. She included a photograph of herself and Small Thunder, now a sturdy 6-year-old with bright eyes and an irrepressible smile that could light up any room. The response came 6 weeks later. Not just a letter, but a package containing photographs, documents, and gifts from relatives Elena had never known she had. Anna Svoboda, now Anna Kratochvil, married with children of her own, had spent years trying to trace what had happened to her brother Pavel and his family. She had assumed they were all dead until Elena's name appeared in a newspaper article about innovative educational programs on the frontier. The correspondence that followed revealed an extended family tree that Elena had never imagined. Aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, and nephews, an entire network of relatives who had been wondering about their American relatives for years. They sent photographs and stories, recipes, and songs, pieces of Elena's heritage that she had thought were lost forever. But perhaps the most precious item in Anna's package was a small wooden carving, a sparrow almost identical to the one Pavel had been making for Small Thunder before his death. Their grandfather had carved it for Pavel when he was Small Thunder's age, and Anna had kept it as a memento of the brother she thought she had lost. Elena showed the carving to Small Thunder, telling him the story of their grandfather and the tradition of wooden birds that had been passed down through their family for generations. Small Thunder studied the carving with the serious attention he brought to all important matters, then looked up at Elena with his clear blue eyes. "Sister, can you make birds too?" Elena laughed, realizing that her nephew had identified exactly what she needed to learn next. "I can learn how. And someday I'll teach you so you can make birds for your own children." That summer, Elena took Small Thunder on a journey that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. They traveled by train to New York City, then by steamship across the Atlantic, then by smaller trains and carriages, to the small Czech village where Pavel Novak had been born. The reunion with her father's family was emotional and overwhelming in the best possible way. Elena found herself surrounded by people who shared her features, her mannerisms, her stubborn streak, and her deep love of stories. Small Thunder was initially shy around these new relatives, who spoke a language he only half remembered, but quickly warmed to the attention and the endless supply of pastries and toys that seemed to materialize whenever he was nearby. For 3 months, Elena and Small Thunder lived in the village where their father and grandfather had grown up. Elena learned traditional Czech crafts and songs, listened to family stories that filled gaps in her understanding of her heritage, and most importantly, learned to carve wooden birds under the patient instruction of her great-uncle František. But even as Elena reconnected with her birth culture, she found herself increasingly homesick for the wide skies of the prairie and the faces of her Lakota family. Small Thunder was more direct. In expressing his feelings after 6 weeks in Bohemia, he announced that he missed his other grandmother, White Dove, and wanted to know when they could go home to their real house. The comment stung at first, but Elena quickly realized that Small Thunder was expressing a fundamental truth. The Czech village was an important part of their heritage, a connection to their past that deserved respect and preservation. But it was not their home. Home was the place where they had built meaningful relationships and created important work where they were needed and valued for who they had become rather than who they had been born to be. When Elena and Small Thunder returned to their frontier school that autumn, they brought with them not just gifts and photographs, but a deeper understanding of their own complex identity. They were Czech Americans and Lakota Americans, and simply Americans, carrying multiple traditions without being limited or defined by any single one. The school continued to grow and flourish beyond Elena's most optimistic expectations. Her innovative methods attracted students from increasingly diverse backgrounds, not just white settlers and Lakota children, but Mexican Americans, freed slaves moving west to start new lives, Chinese immigrants working on railroad construction, and children from various other tribal nations. The little school became a laboratory for the kind of multicultural education that would not become widespread until generations later. Elena never married despite several offers from men who were intrigued by her unusual life story and demonstrated strength of character. She often said with a smile that she was already married to her work, to her students, and to the vision of a world where children could grow up understanding that difference was a source of strength rather than conflict. Small Thunder grew into a remarkable young man, equally comfortable in a business suit or traditional Lakota regalia, fluent in 5 languages, and skilled in everything from classical literature to traditional hunting techniques. He eventually became a lawyer, specializing in cases involving tribal rights and cultural preservation, carrying forward the work that his father had begun and his sister had continued. As Elena entered her 60s, she began to think seriously about retirement and the legacy she would leave behind. The school had graduated hundreds of students who had gone on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, artists, and community leaders throughout the American West. Many of them credited their success to the lessons they had learned about cultural understanding and the power of cooperation across seemingly insurmountable differences. But Elena's most important legacy was not measured in her students' individual achievements or the recognition she had received from educational institutions. It was measured in the simple fact that the communities she served had learned to live together in relative peace and mutual respect. The old hatreds and fears had not disappeared entirely, probably never would completely, but they had been replaced by something more hopeful and sustainable. Children who had played together in Elena's classroom grew up to become adults who saw cooperation as natural and conflict as a choice to be avoided rather than an inevitability to be endured. On Elena's 65th birthday, the combined communities threw a celebration that would have been unimaginable when she first arrived as a frightened captive. White settlers and Lakota families, Mexican ranchers and Chinese merchants all gathered together to honor the woman who had taught them that building bridges was more rewarding and more practical than building walls. Iron Wolf, now in his 70s, but still remarkably spry, gave a speech in which he called Elena the best daughter any man could hope for. White Dove, her hair silver but her eyes still bright with intelligence and humor, presented Elena with a special gift, a traditional Lakota dress decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of Elena's journey from captive to teacher to bridge builder. But the most meaningful moment of the celebration came when Small Thunder, now Thomas Thunder Novak, a successful lawyer and father of 3, stood to address the assembled crowd. "My sister saved my life when I was a baby," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered families. "But more than that, she saved my future. She made sure I would grow up knowing all the parts of myself, Czech and Lakota, and American, traditional and modern, rooted in the past, but ready for whatever future we choose to create." He paused, looking directly at Elena with the same trust and love he had shown as a toddler reaching for her protection. "She taught me that I didn't have to choose between worlds. I could live fully in all of them and help others learn to do the same. That's the greatest gift anyone can give a child, the knowledge that they don't have to be just one thing, that they can be everything they are capable of becoming." As the celebration continued into the evening, Elena found herself standing apart from the crowd for a few quiet minutes, looking up at the stars that had guided her through so many difficult nights. She thought about her parents, who had dreamed of peace between peoples and had died before seeing that dream begin to take shape. She thought about the terrified 15-year-old girl who had begged for mercy beside a burned wagon, not knowing that mercy would transform her into someone capable of changing the world one student at a time. Most of all, she thought about the future, about her students' children and their children's children, who would grow up in a world where cooperation across cultural lines was normal rather than revolutionary, where difference was celebrated rather than feared. Elena reached into her pocket and withdrew the wooden sparrow that had started it all, the one her father had been carving for Small Thunder, the one Iron Wolf had picked up from the dust beside their destroyed wagon so many years ago. The wood was worn smooth from decades of handling, but the bird's essential form remained clear and strong. She had learned to carve her own birds over the years, had taught Small Thunder and dozens of her students to continue the tradition. Each bird was unique, reflecting the individual personality and cultural background of its creator, but all of them shared the same essential meaning: hope, freedom, and the courage to build something beautiful, despite the destruction and hatred that too often surrounded them. As Elena looked up at the eternal stars, she whispered a prayer in Czech, thanking her parents for the values they had passed down to her. Then she spoke in Lakota, thanking Iron Wolf and White Dove and Running Deer for the family they had given her when she had no family left. Finally, she spoke in English, thanking the country that had provided the space and opportunity for all these traditions to coexist and flourish together. The wooden sparrow seemed to warm in her hand, as if responding to her words with life of its own. Elena smiled and returned it to her pocket, then walked back toward the celebration where her family, biological and chosen past and present and future, waited for her return. In the distance, a night bird called across the prairie, its song carrying on the wind like a promise that some things endure beyond individual lives, beyond cultural conflicts, beyond the fear and hatred that too often divide human communities into warring camps. Elena had learned to listen for those songs of hope, to trust in their message even when the darkness seemed overwhelming. Tonight, surrounded by the people she had loved and served and taught, that song seemed particularly clear and strong. The girl who had once begged for mercy had become a woman who created it, one student at a time, one relationship at a time, one carefully carved wooden bird at a time. It was not the grand gesture that filled history books, but it was the quiet, persistent work that actually changed the world. As Elena rejoined the celebration, Small Thunder's youngest daughter ran up to her and tugged on her dress with the insistence that only 6-year-olds could muster. "Aunt Elena," the child asked with wide, curious eyes, "will you tell us the story again about the sister and the baby and the warriors who became family?" Elena smiled and lifted the child onto her hip, feeling the familiar weight and warmth of a young life full of unlimited potential and boundless hope. "Of course, little sparrow," she said, using the nickname that had become traditional for the youngest children in their extended family. "But remember, it's not just a story about what happened long ago. It's the beginning of your story too, and someday you'll tell your own children about the choices you made and the bridges you built." And as Elena began to speak, her voice carrying across the prairie night like a song of its own, and the wooden sparrow in her pocket seemed to sing along, adding its small but persistent voice to the great chorus of hope that had sustained her through decades of building bridges between worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart. The story was complete, but the work would never end. And that, Elena realized as she told the old tale to a new generation of listeners, was exactly as it should be. Each generation would face its own challenges, make its own choices, carve its own wooden birds of hope. But they would not face those challenges alone, because they would carry with them the wisdom and love of all who had come before. Under the vast, star-filled sky of the American prairie, surrounded by the laughter of children who embodied the best possibilities of human cooperation, Elena knew that her father's dream of peace between peoples was not just a beautiful impossibility. It was a living reality that grew stronger with each passing day, one child, one story, one small act of courage at a time.